My guest today is Raghuram Rajan. He is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Prior to that, he was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and before that, the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. His academic work is focused on financial markets, credit cycles, and banking policy. He has published 4 books, the most recent of which is The Third Pillar: How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind.
Where are we in the pandemic? Do you think, like some people, that this is going to be something that we can more or less put behind us in a couple of months and go more or less back to normal? Do you think that it's unlikely and that the economy is likely to be underperforming for a very long time and that this is going to have long-run implications?
Well, first, great to be with you, Luis, and this is a great thing you're doing. Let's take the 2 parts, the medical side and then the economic side. On the medical side, we now know that even in democracies, it's possible to bend the curve, to have reasonable social isolation such that the number of cases eventually gets contained to a moderate number, and the pressure on medical facilities falls considerably. The peak load, in a sense, gets attenuated. Now the key medical question is, if we don't see a vaccine in quick time, if we don't see very cheap and easy testing such that anybody who walks into a room can put their finger on some kind of a machine and get tested for whether they have the virus or not, and if we don't see effective antibody testing, okay, you have had the virus, you're safe, you may go in, then I think, and if we don't see a cure, of course, if we see a effective cure, take this medicine, you're okay in a few hours or in a couple of days, the rate of death falls considerably, then it becomes something like the common cold or the common flu, not the fear that we have of the coronavirus. If none of these happen within the next year or so, we're going to have to go back in a very measured way. I mean, the crowded bars and the crowded discos are not going to be possible, nor are the crowded cruise ships, and not even crowded airplanes. So what is the process by which we get back through a substantial social distancing? Most people, go to office where they're spread out. If they have to be in office, and they try and work from home if they can work from home. Industrial workers have adequate spacing. Those pictures we see of Chinese workers having their lunch 6 feet apart, that will be the norm for quite some time. That means that we go back from this low level of GDP we have reached with the lockdowns to a high level of GDP, but it takes a year or more to go back to anywhere near parity with where we were. Of course, we've lost growth in the process. And it's also quite possible that a number of firms fail. Restaurants won't be able to survive this long period, many of them. Hopefully, the big firms that have a lot of human capital and social capital, which you've written a lot about, they survive into this post-pandemic period. And so the bulk of employment is still there. And new restaurants, new small shops start up quickly on the basis of credit availability, and the economy gets back. It's not going to be a V-shaped recovery. It's probably going to be a delayed recovery over time, but it's also not going to be the Great Depression.
So now let's move on to some of these longer-term effects of these crises and how the world is going to change. And the first obvious thing that fits with this very much with this virus, with this pandemic, the first big trend that we were seeing that fits with this pandemic is the trend towards, let's say, deglobalization or anti-globalization. People like the chief trade advisor of Trump, people like Donald Trump, would see something like this and say, you see what we were saying, you need all the value chains to be localized at home. We need to source all products at home so that we don't depend on foreign suppliers. We need to make bigger barriers and bigger borders to avoid viruses coming in. people with that outlook potentially would be reinforced, and we could see potentially an increase in walls worldwide, an increase in trade barriers and in all sorts of other barriers. Is this something that could happen? Should we be worried about it? How do you see these globalization, anti-globalization forces moving or reacting to this?
I mean, it certainly is a possibility. And I think it depends very much on the leadership we have during the recovery, of which the most important person in the world will be the US president. I think the tone that is set from there essentially sets the tone in many other countries. The US pushing a particular line tends to find sympathy in a number of other countries pushing that same line and offers support to those countries. And it is quite possible if we have President Trump re-elected, that we get a more nationalistic, divisive, sort of each country within its own borders line. That is unsustainable over the medium to long term. But certainly that's a line that will fall on some, some ears that want to listen. And there are, others in the world who would espouse that line, whether it's Orban in Hungary or others across the world. There is an element, however, of the recent experience. There are a number of elements which would suggest that a leader who wants to take the opposite stand could, in fact, make a strong case. So, how did it work out for global cooperation, or how did it work out for the fight against the pandemic, with countries fighting each other for medical supplies, for countries actually hijacking medical supplies from each other's airports? Countries exercising their might is right attitude. Yes, we are the biggest, so we can get the supplies we need, and it doesn't matter. So that's one kind of behavior that might alarm people. Well, what happens next time we have a big problem? Are we going to see this? We already saw versions of it in the trade conflicts that happened before the pandemic. Might is right. And the whole idea of the post-World War order was, yes, we'll give a little bit to might, but in general, we have to have rules that bind everyone. And that broke down with the trade conflicts. It's broken down even more with the fight over medical supplies, as well as a lack of cooperation. Some countries completely left on their own, even though they belong to unions, they belong to the larger group of nations, and very little help forthcoming at that point. So that is one thing that the globally minded will point to. The other is no country is an island. Even if you build high walls, immigration, legal or illegal, will always happen. We know that there are so many ways borders are crossed. I mean, the whole point of believing this was a Chinese disease or a pandemic and it would stay in China was, we realized the world is too integrated for that. And before we know it, it's everywhere in the world. So you can't deal with the virus anywhere until you've dealt with it everywhere. Otherwise, it'll come back in some form or the other. And so I think this emphasizes the need for global cooperation, not just amongst the rich countries, but amongst all countries. The next phase of the virus will be developing countries and emerging markets, which haven't even got into the fight yet in a big way. And if they're not careful, what happened in Italy, in Spain, in the United States will seem mild compared to what happens there. So I think this may actually convince us that we are one planet and we cannot turn our faces away from what's happening elsewhere. And that means, again, more focus on how can we cooperate better.
So that's a hopeful finish. And